Happy Tuesday. I hope you had a nice long bank holiday weekend. Welcome to our BIMA webinar, Navigating Digital Accessibility. My name's Matt, and I'm the MD at BIMA. I'm just going to say thanks for coming and just give everything a little bit of context, and then I'm going to pass you over to these three lovely people who are going to be the stars of the show today. You're here because you're probably pretty familiar with BIMA, and you've probably been to various things that we've done. We're a bit like a trade body, a community of people and businesses that operate around this convergence of creativity and digital. We do lots of different things. We'll have AI councils, sustainability councils. We have an inclusive design council, but we do a lot of other stuff around accessibility in digital design. And specifically at the moment, because it's next Thursday, I think it's next Thursday, it's Global Accessibility Day, GAD. And so this is the first of 3 or 4 different events that we've got in relation to that topic. So this is going to be a webinar format. I'm going to pass you over to Joel in a minute, who's kindly going to kind of host and moderate. Joel, I'll let you introduce our speakers, if that's okay with you. There's very little housekeeping. We're on a webinar format, so you can see us, we can't see you. So like sit back, chill, eat your cup, drink your cup of tea, eat a slice of toast and enjoy the content. But we do want to make it interactive if we can. And the best way to do that is just to use the Q&A function. So you can put comments in, but if you ideally, please just use the Q&A because it's easy for us to kind of answer them and then discard them once we've answered them. That's kind of it from me. I did mention a couple of other events all around Global Accessibility Day. It's next week. Next week, we've got a round table, which has been run by our council. And the week after that, hopefully see some of you at the Acquia Engage event. Which my final point is, it's a big thank you to Acquia. So we work with Acquia a lot around different subjects, and we know this is a real sort of passion point for them around digital accessibility. So they support a lot of our webinars, roundtables. So a big thank you to Acquia and also Accelerant, because I know you partner with them. Joel is at Nemensa. He's our host. A big thank you to you too. And thanks to Nemensa. I think that's it for me. I've got a few things I needed to say. I've said them all. So on with the show. Thank you to the 3 of you for doing this. I hope everybody enjoys it. I'll go off camera and leave it to you.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. Really exciting to be here. We've got lots of interesting topics to talk about today. So really exciting to sort of kick things off. What I'll do, I'll just start by setting some context about today's topic. I'm going to then briefly introduce the speakers today, and then we'll kind of get started on some of these key talking points, essentially. As mentioned, anyone who's attending, please do ask any questions you have within the Q&A functionality within the Zoom, and we will obviously try to get through those questions as we move through the talking points today. So just to set a little context, so I should say the theme of today's conversation is accessibility and merging design, tech, and content. So it's a big topic. I think it's fair to say that accessibility as a topic is continuing to get attention within various industries. Digital accessibility in particular seems to be changing quite quickly within the last few years. The importance of providing accessible experiences for people is critical, and we'll obviously look at that in a bit more detail now. Before we sort of lead into that topic, though, I'll just introduce myself. So, yeah, my name's Joel Strohmeyer. I'm a principal accessibility consultant at Nemensa, which is an experienced design consultancy. I'm based in Bristol in the UK, and I've done various work with both private and public sector organizations across all sorts of different industries. One of the focus areas, I would say, in recent years for me has been working in the public sector space, in particular working with the likes of NHS, Department for Work and Pensions, and various other public sector organizations. So hopefully I can bring some of those insights from the public sector world in today's conversation. Then we've got Shweta Sharma, who's Director of Quality Engineering Services at Accelerant. And we've got Jasmine de Guzman, who is Director of International Marketing at Acquia. What I'd like to just start with, if that's okay, is asking a question to both of you, both of my sort of colleagues or co-panelists here today. And that's, before we move into sort of some of the, I guess, the chunkier questions, the meatier questions we have listed here, I think it's really important to start with definitions. So can I ask the question, what does the word accessibility mean to you? And maybe starting with Shweta, if that's okay.
Yeah, I think accessibility is about creating products and services that is usable, and it creates good user experiences, especially for people with disabilities. That's, let's make it very clear. Accessibility is nothing about, you know, just, having a wide range of users, but it's purely focusing on users with disabilities, and the focus is primarily on such users. And that's what accessibility is.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I think you're kind of getting at this distinction between maybe inclusion more broadly and accessibility. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then Jasmine, please, anything else to add in terms of definitions before we move on?
Of course. I mean, for me, it's really about ensuring equitable access, right? So while a lot of us will use our trackpads and our keyboards or a mouse and a keyboard to access the internet and the web and all of these digital services, it doesn't mean that there's other ways not to access it. You might be using a screen reader, you might be using a mouth stick because of mobility issues, and just making sure that all of these people are able to access the information that they need equitably is really the definition for me when it comes to accessibility.
Okay, yeah. Some brilliant definitions there for sure. And I think that actually sort of brings me on to technology, actually. We've already sort of started talking about technology within those in sort of introductory definitions. So with that in mind, I think from my perspective, essentially technology has always been a critical part of accessibility. But in the modern world, I suppose, what we're talking about kind of the future of accessibility to an extent today. What do we think the role of technology is in creating accessible content in sort of the next few years? Shweta.
Yeah, I think again, when it comes to technology, it's important to realize that technology itself is diverse, and how well it is kind of supporting accessibility today. So if I have to categorize how technology supports accessibility, we today have accessibility checkers, tools that help us, quickly scan websites, like huge websites, large number of websites, and it would help us identify issues, basic issues related to color contrast, missing alt text, etc. Right? It certainly adds to a lot of efficiency. There's a lot of AI-powered content creation that is helping us create simpler sentences today, sentences that are readable, comprehensible by people with, people having cognitive impairments. There are content conversion tools today that are helping us, creating a more semantic structure when it comes to converting, converting our PDFs, converting our docs, and ensuring that accessibility issues are fixed while conversion. You speak of automated captioning and transcription that helps us with live video streaming for users that have visual impairments in that case. And today we have CMSs like Drupal also that are helping us create more accessible themes. And what I mean by accessible themes is there are many accessible ready themes which can be plugged in your Drupal core.
That's interesting. You mentioned there about efficiency, which I think is a really interesting point here. So certainly it feels like, yeah, there's a key role from a technological point of view in speeding up potentially the process of embedding accessibility. Jasmine, I wonder if you have any more thoughts on that kind of this efficiency role for technology, and are there other key sort of roles for producing accessible content that the latest technology brings to bear?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Shweta just said is incredibly valid and true. We do need to use automated tools to make it more efficient, make it more cost effective as well to be accessible. But I do think what's very interesting is that you still do need this human element. And so what we always talk about in our team is making sure that, yes, we're using automation to speed things up, but there's always human verification, human validation, because it is an automated process and there is human context that they will get wrong or they will get incorrectly. Or you mentioned AI. AI is still developing and does not always have that human context. And so for me, it's also about making sure that there is clear guidelines in your team and making sure that everyone's thinking in an accessibility first mindset. So for example, I work in a marketing team. All of the content that we produce outward needs to be accessible, whether that be a video or if we're working on our website. Then I need to make sure that the different people in the team also understand that as part of our compliance journey, right? So if we're working with a developer, whether internal or external, making sure that he understands what accessibility is from a development point of view, making sure our content writer is, as Shweta mentioned, having simple sentences to make sure that that's accessible, that the designer understands color contrast. So making sure that you have that accessibility first mindset already embedded makes it also that much faster and speeds it up, right? So yes, you need automation to speed it up, but you also need that accessibility mind first and education. And so one of the first things I always do when a new team member onboards is have them take the W3C's Introduction to Web Accessibility course that is open and available to all, because it's important for them to start just understanding the fundamentals, and then they can go out and further educate themselves in their area of expertise. And so it's really everyone's responsibility, even though we do use tools to help further accelerate that.
That's a really interesting point. I think, yeah, something I was keen to explore was this. I guess one of the challenges with some of the automated tools is interpretation of the results themselves. So they can, I guess, in some ways tell you where an issue lies, but not always do all tools necessarily tell you the kind of why aspect. So, you know, what the kind of impact is for users of fixing this issue. But that resource you mentioned, the W3C qualification, is definitely one I would recommend as well for anyone who's sort of watching today. Maybe we can share a link out to that, you know, later in the session. So you mentioned there about sort of onboarding training aspects. Do you have any sort of specific examples or case stories of where you've kind of combined this kind of onboarding training or alongside the use of tools that you could maybe elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, I joined Acquia via the acquisition of Monsito, which is a tool as well that scans websites and helps identify issues in accessibility. So for me, the big combination is making sure that people understand how to utilize our tool. And just like you said, Joel, interpret the results. So while our tool can scan a website and help you find an image that does not have an alt text, there's still manual checks in there. So for images that do have an alt text, it's also about making sure that the alt text is valuable and meaningful in the context, right? And so those are the kinds of things where I combine the usage of the tool, but also having people do courses like this, because I think a lot of marketers, which is my background, do understand that it is valuable to have alternative text on an image for SEO purposes, but a lot of people will use and abuse that for SEO, stuff keywords in there, but that doesn't give a meaningful experience for people. So that's really how I try to work with it is, hey, this is the use of our combining the use of our tool in some of these everyday marketing practices, but also looking at it from the accessibility perspective. And that goes for plenty of things, right? Also, descriptive link text, for example, on buttons. I know a lot of marketers are guilty of that. Read more, read more, read more. And I think a lot of people, the first time they see a screen reader in use and they see what a terrible user experience, going back to what Shweta mentioned before, it's about the user experience. That is really eye-opening for a lot of marketers and thinking, okay, we do need to do something about it.
That's a really interesting point also about how I suppose accessibility has to understand the differing targets and sort of outcomes different teams will have, as you say. So, you know, marketing might be looking through one lens and I don't know, you know, the product manager might be looking through another and so on and so forth. So this is certainly this thing around assigning responsibilities and people being clear on what their role is. But we've got the European Accessibility Act arriving. Well, it's kind of, the details are starting to be fleshed out in the background at the moment with a sort of due date of June 28th, 2025. Shweta, I wonder if you have any thoughts about how you predict that the European Accessibility Act may change the sort of face of accessibility. Do you have any concerns, or do you any observations about how you think that act is going to change the industry?
Yeah, I think so. Let's try to understand what EAA is, right? So the EAA, it's a directive of the European Union aimed at improving the functioning of the internal market by making a range of essential products and services accessible. And you would find those range of products and services available on website as well. If I were to name some, then it's clearly, banking products and services, it's websites, mobile applications, and yeah, so that's like, those are few products and services that are covered by EAA. And there's already a standard in place in the Europe, which is EN 301549. So that's more technically focused, whereas EAA is more of an act, and it aims to bring the European Union together to provide uniform and universal accessibility experiences for ICT, which is information and communication and technology products that fall under that. And speaking of impact, yes, certainly, it's a directive, it's an act that comes into picture, and organizations need to start thinking about how do they comply with this particular act. And if you speak of, how do you go about, or how do you prepare for compliance, then I would say, start identifying which products and services in your organization would be covered by EAA. Start by having an accessibility audit, develop a roadmap and accessibility, have an accessibility plan, invest in training, and consider training across all relevant roles. Just few minutes ago we spoke of how multiple roles are involved in creating accessible experiences, right from designers to business analysts to developers to testers and even content marketeers. So ensure that you have role-based training, and the impact is going to be huge, and you can find the range of products and services published on the net.
Yeah, I think it is interesting, actually. I was working with various public sector organizations when the public sector bodies regulations were introduced, and I wasn't sure at the time actually what what the impact would be. But actually, as you've just pointed out, that introduction of that sort of legislation, should we call it, certainly created an influx of inquiries about completing accessibility audits and creating statements for lots of organizations. So it seems perhaps a shame that you have to introduce legislation to encourage organizations to prioritize accessibility, but I think it is likely to have the desired effect, as you say, in bringing up this kind of baseline standard of accessibility. What do we think the role of sort of tools would be with the introduction of the EAA, Jasmine?
I mean, I think the demand for tools or web accessibility or digital accessibility tools will really just increase, right? I think the really interesting thing with the European Accessibility Act, which is a little bit different from the previous European Union Web Accessibility Directive, which then has been incorporated as the public sector bodies legislation in the UK. That was very much focused on public sector and on the websites. The interesting thing with the European Accessibility Act is it's much further widespread. So yes, it does impact websites in a lot of industries, especially e-commerce and banking and finance, as Shweta mentioned, but it also impacts the digital accessibility of physical digital experiences. So if you think about an ATM or one of those kiosks that you check in on a touchscreen at the airport, those are also digital accessibility experiences that are being impacted by this act. And the interesting thing as well is that countries will be transposing the European Accessibility Act in different ways, meaning, yes, the European Accessibility Act is the baseline, but different countries can transpose it into national law with additional requirements. So everyone I've been talking to, if you're looking for a web accessibility or digital accessibility tool, I do think it is very important, like Shweta mentioned, to do an accessibility audit based off of what's applicable specifically for your business and the countries that you operate in, because that will then help you identify what kind of tools you need. So there's no like plug and play solution. And I know that's what a lot of people are looking for, is like, what can I do to just be compliant? That's not the reality when it comes to accessibility. Yes, there's automated tools that can help speed up the work, but you do need to set aside budget, resources, and time to make a proper investment. But I think it will pay off in the end as well, just because you're improving the user experience for a huge group of people. I mean, the World Health Organization estimates that 16% of the world population lives with some kind of disability. Another very overlooked thing, especially in the European Union, is the elderly population, both in the UK and in the European Union. And a lot of accessibility principles are also just good user experience principles that will also benefit the elderly as we go into aging populations, right? So making sure that button sizes or target sizes are a certain size, that's not only helpful for a person with a disability, but also an elderly person who may be suffering from some kind of syndrome where their hands are shaking. So there's huge impact on businesses, and tools are definitely necessary to help improve that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a point actually I've spoken about before. This overlap, as you say, between I think one of the challenges I've certainly seen in organizations previously who maybe haven't treated accessibility with the same seriousness maybe as other areas of the business is partly maybe just not the visibility of accessibility issues within the organization. So I think this idea of perhaps combining manual offline audit data with automated tool information into sort of dashboards, we've seen some at Nomensa, we've seen some success. Again, just simply the visibility of kind of some of these key measures and tracking that over time can be effective. But I think maybe broader than that, which is what I think the point you were talking about there, was this idea of understanding how more accessible and inclusive experiences can feed into the overarching organizational sort of commercial success. I think that still seems to be something that's not spoken about as much, but as you say, target sizes, the ease of being able to fill in forms, preventing errors and so on and so forth. You should be able to track those things relatively easily with, alongside your kind of general conversion rates if you're an organization that sort of is particularly interested in those measures. I think something interesting is sort of how do we future-proof? So obviously we've got these we've got tools arriving, and they're continually they're more intelligent and they help with efficiency. What other aspects do we need to consider when we're thinking about future-proofing? One thing you mentioned there was around funding. So Shweta, do you have any thoughts about how does funding sort of feed into the ongoing success? And are there other factors you would point to in terms of future-proofing your accessibility endeavors?
Right. I think it really needs to start from the top level, right? We need to have executive buy-in. We need to start creating a lot of awareness and education in terms of what benefits do accessible products create in general for the organization. While, yes, if you speak of legal compliance and all of that, yes, that is like kind of enforcing. But if you think of how accessibility and inclusive design experiences can also foster innovation, right? And lead to more business and lead to more better brands. I think this is where the executives also you start gaining attention of your executives. Have you thought how electric toothbrushes were invented in first place, right? They were invented for people with motor disabilities. Have you ever thought how Audibles was invented, right? So, and this is used by a wide variety of audience today. So I think you need to start by speaking of the advantages that an organization would have, rather than just looking at a very shallow and superficial level, which is compliance. And if you also speak, you need to have accessibility champions within your executive group, and then down there. And you need to start speaking of everyday accessibility impacts. And I was I a few months ago I posted one experience that I noticed with my 2-year-old niece, and she was operating Amazon's Alexa. She can barely speak, right? But yet in her gibberish tone, she was able to play multiple songs. One was like, by, I think it was by Bones, Ai. So, she doesn't know how to say Alexa. She'll just press the action button and she'll just say, yeah. And Alexa plays there. So, there's a lot of that goes on in the background, which is, natural language processing and machine learning. So, right. So this is how technology in a way also supports creating more accessible experiences. But I think if you speak of future proofing or securing those funds for your organization, you need to start creating awareness in terms of everyday use cases rather than speaking at a very shallow level of, so, usually, like, I know developers, they are not able to relate to how having good color contrast actually creates more accessible experiences. So we need to blend the technical language plus the user experience, and that's how you create awareness. So I think it's about, how it would foster innovation, how it would lead to, better brand identity and all of that. I think that's the path to go ahead.
That's really interesting points about kind of bringing it back away from the technical and into sort of the day-to-day experiences. And again, I guess talking in a language that, different audiences are going to understand. And certainly, yeah, I've seen some success in that area as well. So yeah, some fantastic points there. Is there anything more on this idea of future-proofing or how you sort of continue to make sort of gather momentum from an accessibility perspective that you would like to add, Jasmine?
I mean, I think it's also just staying on top of the changes in the accessibility space, right? So I know Shweta mentioned the EN 301549, which we've heard so much about. That is, of course, the European Union standard, but they do lean up against the W3Cs, which is the Worldwide Web Consortium's, their web content accessibility guidelines, which are just the internationally recognized kind of standard. And of course, they just released 2.2 in October of last year. So making sure that, yes, EN 301549 might only recommend that you do WCG 2.1, or I know at least there's some legislations that in other countries as well that only recommend 2.1. Making sure that you're overachieving on it is really making sure that you're future-proofing. So going above and beyond. Compliance is just the base level, in my opinion. And we should always be looking at what additional things we can do, just because it does create those everyday user experience stories that Shweta was mentioning.
Yeah, this is also a really important point, actually. Yeah, that there's different kind of rates of progress depending on which type of guidance documentation you're looking at. So that's a really good point as well. I think certainly from a kind of components or design systems perspective, we at Nemensa quite often share different resources by different organizations, whether again it be public or private sector. So I know, for example, that eBay has quite a good and robust set of components that we can refer to in our audits and point to kind of solutions which have already had accessibility integrated from a kind of interface perspective. So we find that quite useful. And again, there's quite a lot of really interesting observations at a kind of service design level. So thinking about the entire service that maybe an organization is creating, again, coming from different public sector voices within, again, the UK government as well, just as a couple of examples, which again kind of move one beyond maybe just the web guidelines and kind of ask people almost to push for even greater standards in what they're building. I did notice here, we've got a couple of questions, which I'll just read out, and then we can decide who wants to have a go at answering, or maybe we can all answer. Because I think we're doing quite well for time at the moment, I notice. So the first one was from Alvaro, and it says, which courses would you recommend to educate visual designers aside from the W3C one? So I don't know, I'm just trying to think if I can think of any visual design training. The first one that comes to mind from my perspective, there is a course by Derek Featherstone, or at least there was, which is what was part of the LinkedIn Learning. I think it's been rebranded now, but that Derek comes at things through quite a kind of design lens, and I would say there will be certainly some really useful insights from that training if that's still available. I think you should be able to do that via a trial. So that would be my recommendation. Does anyone else have any sort of visual design resources, I guess, that they can point towards for Alvaro?
So I believe even Figma has certain inclusive design resources. It has some UI kits which come with accessibility standards. It also provides community-wide education to create awareness on accessibility guidelines. And apart from that, what we've done at Accelerant is we've kind of demystified the WCAG guidelines, which could be quite difficult to comprehend when one goes through. It's quite overwhelming. So what we've done is, that's an internal activity that we've done. We've kind of broken down WCAG into simpler, readable, comprehensible guidelines, and we've created in a spreadsheet. So if you're a designer, you could just filter using the designer label or the designer role, and it would list down all the WCAG success criteria that would be applicable when you would be considering design. And you could read through those guidelines, understand with examples, and that's also part of our introduction training or onboarding when we have new joinees at Accelerant. Yeah, so that's like one way to weave in as part of your org-wide training.
Yeah, I think that's another key point actually, which we touched upon before, but this idea of one of the challenges maybe when you're first starting out to learn about accessibility is the sheer amount of information and being able to distinguish between the kind of signal and the noise. So if you're looking specifically at the visual design aspects of accessibility, as Shrita just said there, one of the tasks which you can speak with a sort of external agency or sort of expert support to help you with is to kind of go through and work out which of these checks or guidelines are applicable to you and which are less so, I guess. But certainly also then rewriting them into maybe simpler to understand language. The director of accessibility at Nemensa is on the kind of he's co-editor, I should say, of the guidelines. But we often have conversations where he recognizes that because they have to apply to so many different contexts and industries, they're written in such a way that they're not always easy to understand when you're trying to deliver, say, an accessible design. So there's an inherent sort of challenge there with the way the guidelines are written. So part of the way of addressing that is maybe working with an organization to rewrite them as mentioned. So yeah, that's definitely a good recommendation there. Jasmine, was there anything else in terms of sort of?
I don't have a great resource for you, but I would say go out and ask other visual designers. Really, knowledge sharing on this is probably one of the biggest things I've learned about the accessibility community. Often people are incredibly passionate. So I would even just recommend posting on LinkedIn or even if you have a visual designer group that you're part of, like either Slack community or elsewhere, ask people, because normally people are incredibly willing to share just because it does make such a big impact for people. So that would be my best advice.
No, that's a really good one, actually, and one I hadn't thought of as I was sort of trying to come up with solutions. So definitely, yeah, using the community. There's a lot of passionate people out there who are more than happy to support. So I think that's a great point, actually. Yeah. And then we have another couple of questions here, actually, and then we'll probably move back to some of these other talking points. Which free tools are available to check for compliance with EAA? Thanks. So.
Well, I can jump in here, and yeah. I know we're jumping the gun a little bit, but we'd be happy at Monsito and Acquia to offer a complimentary website scan for you. And so we're going to put up a little poll at the end around that. And ours is, of course, a paid service from an ongoing point of view, but the Wave tool is definitely something that you could, if you're just getting started with, check that out and see. It is a little bit more cumbersome to use, and so I would say that a lot of the other automated tools out there to really help you make progress are paid ones, but the Wave one is a great place to kind of start if you just want to see. And then of course our complimentary scan, first time scan, we'd be happy to help you point you in the right direction too.
Yeah,
yes.
And if you're yes, Joel.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes. So if you are into integrating accessibility as part of your SDLC, then we have a lot of NPM libraries as well. The one that we use is Axe with Axe NPM library along with Cypress. So that way you can ensure that at least code level issues are caught while you are building your product during development, rather than after deploying. So that's also these are all free tools that are available, and Wave is a great resource.
Yeah, that's a really important point there as well, actually, is to try to move away from checking for issues once the content has reached the live environment, because of course the challenge then is that those issues may be experienced, by your customers or your potential customers, your users, your visitors. So if you can integrate checks in the kind of earliest, the earlier you can integrate checks, essentially the better. So that's a really important point to mention there as well. You kind of want to have checks at each major stage if possible. And there was another question here. So how do we consider accessibility for color blindness, and do you know of any useful tools? Well, I think Shweta mentioned something that I've been recommending to different teams I work with, and that is if you're using design tools like Figma, there are generally lots of good plugins that you can run, and they will identify potential contrast issues and also issues for color vision deficiency or color blindness as well. I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything else in there.
I'll give a little plug for, in our browser extension, we have a very helpful tool that lets you simulate different visual impairments as well. So that's another one that if you happen to be a user of our platform, that I highly recommend. But I think also in general, just making sure that you are checking color contrast to begin with really makes a big impact. So if you make sure that your brand colors, that you have pre-approved kind of color contrasts, that normally helps quite a great bit as well, instead of having to do it on one-off kind of a basis.
Yeah, I think one of the most primary tools that we can use to simulate color blindness is using Firefox DevTools. Yeah, so that feature is available in DevTools as well.
So that kind of brings us on to this importance of accessible design. So I can maybe give some thoughts here. I mean, so one of the ways that we can consider accessibility from the design perspective, we've already mentioned about actually the sort of brand identity. I think this is another potential challenge we find in the accessibility world, is that quite often a brand identity has already been established, and then there may be challenges from an accessibility point of view that we need to work with our kind of colleagues in brand and marketing to kind of identify, explain what the impact might be. And to be honest, I've found it may be that you have to come up with a slightly alternative color palette, essentially, or kind of approach to your design, depending on which type of medium you're working in. So in the digital world, you might have a kind of digital color palette, for example, versus maybe what you're using elsewhere. But of course, ideally, you would have it such that your colleagues who are going through the rebranding process are aware enough of accessibility that they're engaging in that process. But I think the real world is quite often that we actually have organizations who've established a brand many years ago, and so there has to be a kind of essentially a collaboration between the accessibility considerations and a kind of consistent brand look. Any other thoughts about how we can sort of design with accessibility in mind from a sort of process perspective?
Well, I would also say one of the important points of design, it's not just, yes, UI is a huge aspect of design, but I would also say this is one of the places or one of the stages where you can actually start thinking and simulating the user workflow. Like, if we take an e-commerce application, have you ever thought about, how would the experience be for a person who has probably, zoomed into the website 200% or 400%? And, how would the add to cart experience look like for such a person? So I feel design is a place where we can start thinking about the actual workflows, and it's a great way to embed accessibility during the design and in the design process. Yes, if you speak of color palette, if you speak of color contrast, if you speak of images, right? Even when we speak of images, people rarely know that the WCAG guidelines do not apply equally to all images. We have different types of images. We have decorative images, we have functional images, right? And the WCAG guidelines differ for each type of image. So if you speak of decorative image, an example would be, it's more like, to add aesthetics on a web page. And in that case, you don't really need an alt attribute. An empty alt attribute would be more than enough. If you speak of an functional image, which would be, more like of a search icon in a search bar, which needs to have appropriate alt text so that, screen reader users understand that, hitting such a button would give you search results. So I think these are some nuances that one can think of in the design phase.
I think that's a really, really great point. Also, just because like if you're categorizing different images as well, so if you're creating a bunch of icons, create like pre-described alt text for the icons, but then also give guidelines on, hey, maybe the icon doesn't need to have an alt text. Maybe it needs to be marked as a decorative image instead.
Right.
And how does that impact the user experience? And I also love what you said about thinking about from the design perspective about the different flows, especially e-commerce. Someone I know, one of my colleagues is a screen reader user and was booking a hotel, and the person made it through all the different steps of booking the hotel, but whoever designed it did not think about the I accept terms and conditions and how a screen reader would be able to check that off. So that last step and following all the way through, even though this is one of the main user experiences and purposes of the website, stopped the person from completing the action. And yes, that is a technical issue, but it's just as important for design to be a part of helping to flag that and integrate that. All of those things need to be able to work together to create a really comprehensive and cohesive user experience. So there's a lot of things, right? And it goes down from color to symbols. Joel, you were talking about how some of these old brands, they might not necessarily have an accessible color palette. Well, then acknowledge that you don't have an accessible color palette, but create a template so that every time you have a form that then uses red to indicate an error, make sure you are also adding an icon. So you're using two different things, and make sure you worked with your content team to have really good error message text that helps inform the user so that they're not just relying on that thin little red line around a form field. So there's a lot of different things you can do, and then templatize it. I think that's the most important thing. If you're a visual designer working with branding, make sure that the templates that you are creating are accessible, and then that those templates are the ones being used. It just saves a lot of time and headache for everyone.
Right.
Yep, the template points, absolutely, which I kind of referred to slightly earlier with my mention of the design system components that we often refer to, as you say. So yeah, a very important point there. I think the other thing to clarify, so we kind of spoke a bit about kind of, I guess, traditional graphic design, but actually what we're talking about here is the importance of content design, which is something, again, I keep coming back to, which is so many of the kind of barriers I tend to see in audits or reviews that I'm completing actually live in that kind of content design space. So as you say, the effective writing of error messages, people, as you say, again, people understanding the different contexts for alternative text, even things like, page titles, those sorts of things. Are they currently clearly within the sort of internal content document templates? Are the people who are creating content, the written word specifically, I guess, aware that it ideally sits with them? Not always is that the case in organizations. So again, it comes back to that kind of roles and responsibilities point, I think. I think we've kind of got a few more topics here, and then I think we might be sort of moving towards closing remarks and any kind of final Q&As, but we've got a little bit more time here. So we have another question here. I'm just going to read it through. So now that screens have kind of plateaued in how little they change, what would be some innovations you would like to see in the future hardware that makes things more accessible? So I think if I'm reading this correctly, this is around, we haven't had any major developments in sort of screens themselves, I'm guessing this is. So we've obviously had this sort of advent of mobile and responsive design, but are there kind of, more sort of future hardware changes that we think will make things more accessible? That's a brilliant question. Does anyone want to, does anyone want to start with their thoughts on that one?
Well, I think I really feel it would vary from industry to industry, product to product, right? Because I've read of one such case study, which was the Xbox adaptive controller. I think that was a huge success story when it came to accessibility. And as part of, so speaking of hardware, right? How we can create accessible experiences by moving beyond software, although software is certainly a part of it, right? But I think we'll have to blend it and weave it within context, within an industry, within certain user base. So I can think of Xbox adaptive controller.
Yeah. So the sort of adaptive controller was was, yeah, kind of, I guess, like a significant step change in the accessibility in the sort of gaming world. So that there was
Gaming, yeah.
a piece of hardware that was highly flexible and allowed various inputs and sort of customizations, which, yeah, made kind of gaming more inclusive and accessible. And yeah, it's a great example, I guess, of a hardware. And it wasn't necessarily kind of a huge shift. You know, it was a case of, I think, practicing inclusive design and not designing
Right.
for people with disabilities, but rather kind of with. So yeah, I mean, that's to the individual who asked that question. It's certainly worth looking at the gaming industry to see real innovation driving changes in the way that things are being designed and built. So yeah, that's a great example. I mean, we've spoken about voice recognition software kind of becoming part of the mainstream, I guess, with things like Alexa, and sort of Google Home devices, those sorts of things. I don't know if it's called Google Home, but the voice recognition software Google has introduced. I can't think of any other major things really in the hardware space off the top of my head. I don't. Most of the sort of research I've been doing is more in the kind of the software space and the kind of artificial intelligence world, really. Okay, so let's move into so that one thing we have largely focused on is accessibility from a kind of website perspective. Largely, one thing that we haven't spoken about a huge amount is the kind of accessibility within other medium and platforms. So, does anyone have any thoughts on what the future of social media accessibility looks like, for example?
Definitely. I mean, there's so much work that needs to be done there. I think there's still a lot of people who aren't aware that they need to, for example, put alt text on images. I've also seen a big increase in people using like camel case and Pascal case examples just to make it easy for people with dyslexia, for example, to read hashtags. But in general, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It's hard because social media as an organization, it's not necessarily a platform you own, right? It's like our websites, we own it, we can control, we're totally up to us what to do with it, but we're a little bit more in the hands of the social media platforms. I do think they're becoming more and more aware of it. And I do see people increasingly using things like alt text or adding descriptions below for images below their LinkedIn posts, for example. LinkedIn, I think it was last year, they added so that you could add captions in on your videos and upload an SRT file. So it's baby steps. I don't know if it's moving as quickly as I'd like it to be, but it'd be interesting to see in the future if they can flag content that is or is not accessible, right? Like PDFs are still a big issue for me, right? Especially in terms of any marketing. People always ask for a PDF, and I was like, great that you want a PDF, but we also have to make sure it is remediated and making sure that that's accessible. And that's something that a lot of people are still not aware of as they're sharing digital content.
Yeah, I think the main point there to really sort of reiterate, I guess, for those attending today is this difference between when you have when you own the platform and when you're kind of borrowing it, essentially. It's a really, really important point, and one that actually, again, we find that quite often organizations make great progress after they've had training, the results of a few audits, and have been able to kind of remediate issues and go through a kind of initial process of, I guess, accessibility maturity, you could call it. But one of the things that definitely is still, I guess, poses a real challenge is when you have third-party tools, for example, like chat functionality within a website where you don't influence the code itself. But again, yeah, the content being shared within social media spaces, again, we can't really be guarantee that a platform won't change its the way it works for the worst. Certainly LinkedIn, though, seems to be one of the better platforms in my experience. But yeah, any other thoughts, Shweta, in terms of non-website content and some of the challenges we have in that space?
I think one of the major challenges that I've been seeing is, especially on LinkedIn, is that, a lot of content is AI generated. And it need not necessarily be simple, comprehensible, although AI provides those features to create simple sentences. So that would be one aspect. And having simple enforcements, like Jasmine mentioned about having hashtags that are more accessible, right? People hardly know that if you use the first letter of every word, if you capitalize the first letter of every word in your hashtag, it becomes more accessible to screen readers, for users using screen readers. Another aspect, it's just a wild thought that I was thinking is, could AI play a picture in creating more accessible experiences on social media? But it's a long way to go. It's a long way to go.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I don't think we're quite there yet, as you say. But on the social media side of things, actually, that there is a good resource again, which I can mention and we'll share in the chat as well. I think it's simply Accessible Social, if I remember correctly, which is a kind of an initiative by kind of one of the world leaders, I guess, in who's decided to focus on accessibility in the social media space. And there's a whole host of guidance on things like the creation of captions for videos, the different formats that are accepted by different platforms. Again, recommendations around how to describe different types of image, all sorts of fantastic guidance, and I believe it's Accessible Social. So if anyone is particularly interested in that side of their kind of digital accessibility, then again, we'll share that link, out as well. I think we're kind of coming towards the sort of last few minutes, essentially, of the session. So I'm just going to recap some of those key points, which is going to test my short-term memory, and then we'll see if there's any final questions. And then I think we've got some sort of thank yous and sign-off items. So I guess let me just go back up here. What are the key things that we've been through today? We've had a conversation. We looked at a little bit about how different platforms can help from an accessibility perspective, but that equally there always needs to be a kind of manual aspect to your accessibility efforts. We've spoken through some of the sort of compliance considerations, things like, for example, again, the European Accessibility Act, and how it's important that we provide training for people to interpret any results that come off the back of audits, whether they be manual or automated, and that people need to be clear on their individual roles for there to be progress made. We've spoken a little bit about how we might sort of integrate accessibility within design processes, whether that be visual design or sort of traditional graphic design, or indeed content design. Again, we've looked at a couple of tools, so different design tools that we can point to, ways that you might integrate accessibility checks within your sort of development processes. Simple tools you can use to run on a page, for example, like Wave or Montego tools. And then we've started to look a little bit about things outside the kind of web interface, so social media and PDFs as other kind of particularly important platforms and content types to consider from an accessibility perspective. So I hope I've done an okay job of summarizing the key points there today. Would either of you, thank you, would either of you like to add any kind of final closing, sort of short closing remarks that I haven't mentioned there?
I would just say that don't be overwhelmed with the guidelines and with all the acts and laws. You don't need to know it all on day one. Just understand what applies in your context and have smaller milestones achieved. A great example would be how we dealt with the University of East London website. We broke it down into smaller milestones, and we could achieve a compliance from 50% to 90+% in less than a year. So we just categorized into smaller milestones by focusing on first keyboard compatibility, then color contrast issues and issues that were related more to the code. And finally, we dealt with screen reader compatibility. So understand one step at a time and have smaller milestones accomplished so that it gives you the required dose of victory and motivation.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Jasmine, anything from you in terms of sort of closing remarks or anything you'd like to signpost?
Well, I just want to applaud you all for being here, because for me, really the first step about addressing digital accessibility is just educating yourself on it. And then not only for visual designers, I just say, don't be afraid to ask for help. There is an amazing accessibility community. And a lot of the times they're so willing to share information, share best practices. So really connect and network with people on this front. And then once you also gain that knowledge and experiences, share that as well, because it'll help inspire other people to do the same. And it's important to do because it's the right thing to do as well, more so than all of the other legislation or milestones and KPIs that you're trying to achieve in terms of a compliance point of view. It's also the right thing to do to make sure everyone has equitable access to this information, products, and services.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, and I would just like to encourage anyone who's joined us today to sort of commit to implementing at least one of the new things that you have learned in today's session in your day-to-day. So please do take away, you know, something that you've learned about accessibility and try to apply that if you can. I'd like to thank today's speakers. So thank you so much for joining us. We also have an event coming up, which is Acquia Engage. So I think the link to that has, the slide for that has been shown on screen now. So yeah, we've got Engage London. So that's May 21st to 22nd. So please do sign up. I think the link has been shared with everyone in the chat. So yes, I encourage everyone to sort of register your interest for that event. That's going to be really interesting. And again, we'll cover all sorts of similar topics in this sort of accessibility and inclusion space. And then I just wanted to also thank Accelerant and Acquia for sort of supporting today's event as well. And the final thing to mention, which we actually touched upon earlier, is that you can make use of a complimentary scan. So you can kind of make use of an automated tool to perform a check on your website, which will support you with some of those web content accessibility guidelines standards and the European Accessibility Act as well. So there's a poll that should be shown now for all of you who are attending to register your interest in that sort of free tool as well. And I think that
Thank you, everyone. I just wanted to say thanks very much on behalf of BIMA. It was really interesting. I've got a poorly child today downstairs, so I'm sort of like almost got a bell downstairs. Going to have a slice of toast. Going to have something to eat. But I caught most of it. It was really interesting. Thanks so much for taking the time to do it. I hope everybody enjoyed the webinar. Links are all there, and we'll send an email with more links to the events and the free tool.
Thank you so much for having us.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Great session. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Bye.